Welcome everyone. Glad you could join us from all over the world. Good that you could be here to learn about China's pyramids, extraterrestrial contact and ancient civilizations. We're going to be covering a slightly different topic to what we did last week. For those of you that attended last week, there are some that didn't attend last week who didn't really know exactly what it was that we covered. So very briefly, last week we just looked at the origins of China's secret space program in terms of the contemporary era, starting from around the 1940s, looking at a particular Chinese scientist and looked at his contribution to China's conventional rocket program and to the secret space program. And so we covered that. Now today, what we're going to be looking at goes much further back. And it's important to understand China's history, the ancient history of China, in order to really fully appreciate the magnitude of the situation China faces today and the situation the entire planet faces today. And it really does mean that we've got to look at these topics of ancient civilizations and also the pyramids, the mystery of the pyramids. You know, what are the pyramids? So we are going to begin now by just looking at the pyramids in China. I mean, everyone I'm sure is very familiar with the pyramids in other parts of the world, South America, Egypt, of course, the most famous. People aren't all that familiar with pyramids in China because it's been deliberately shrouded in secrecy. There's been an effort, a real effort by the Chinese authorities to make it look as though China doesn't have any pyramids, but we know that they do. So where do we get the first recordings of China's pyramids? We can look at the very first report that was covered in newspapers that discussed China's pyramids or sightings of these. And these go back to the Second World War era. The first report was from a pilot that was in 1945. It was during an overflight of Shaanxi province, which is a province in the kind of central northern area of China. And it has the ancient capital of Qian. And this is where a pilot saw this huge pyramid, and he estimated it to be about 1,000 feet high. And the pilot reported it as actually having a capstone. And it was very similar to the Great Pyramid of Giza in terms of the geometric design. So we're not talking about a truncated pyramid. You know, what you see in front of you here is a picture that was published later in 1947 from a second airman who flew over China and also saw a pyramid. And then the New York Times published this photograph 2 or 3 days after that second sighting. And what you see there is a truncated pyramid. Some people call it a trapezoid. We call it trapezoids in Australia. Pronunciation means everything. So this is what some people describe as a trapezoid. They are very common in South America. There are other places in Asia where people have seen these types of pyramids. But the pyramid with the capstones, I mean, those are things that have been sighted in Egypt. And of course, we know the Great Pyramid. So the first sighting of a pyramid that is something that is reported in the Western media was in 1945. And then you had this report from James Guzman from Spring. And it gives you an idea of exactly what it was that was seen. Quote, "I flew around a mountain and then we came to a valley. Directly below us was a gigantic white pyramid. It looked as if it were from a fairy tale. The pyramid was draped in shimmering white. It could have been metal or some other form of stone. It was white on all sides. What was most curious about it was its capstone, a large piece of precious gem-like material. I was deeply moved by the colossal size of the thing. So a 1,000-foot high pyramid, completely white, with a capstone of some precious gem-like material. That was seen in 1945 by this Army Air Force pilot that was flying over Shanxi province during World War II. So now we move to a report that came out from a second pilot. This was in 1947. This was in March. And this was published in a number of newspapers. It was put out by the wire service UP. And the report said, a giant pyramid in isolated mountains of Shanxi province in Western China was reported today by Colonel Maurice Xian, Far Eastern Director for Trans World Airline. From the air, Colonel Xian said the pyramid seems to dwarf those of Egypt. He estimated its height at 1,000 feet and its width at the base of 1,500 feet. The pyramid, he said, is at the foot of the Qingling Mountains, about 40 miles southwest of Shan, capital of the province. Now, this was a very similar sighting to that earlier sighting from 1945 by the Colonel Gaussman. And again, it's a 1,000-foot pyramid, similar to the size of the pyramids in China, similar geometric shape to the Egyptian pyramids. But this one was at the foot of the Qingling Mountains. So this is about 40 miles southwest of Shan, so which is the capital. So this is telling us this pyramid is different to this one. What we have a different. That's a different pyramid. This pyramid that you're seeing here that was published in 1947 by the New York Times. That pyramid, as I said, is a truncated. It's not a finished pyramid with a capstone. This appeared in 1947. And later on, it was identified to be the Maoling Mausoleum, or what is called the Maoling Mausoleum. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So right here, you have a mystery going back to 1947. Why did the New York Times publish this photo of a truncated pyramid, a trapezoid, back in 1947, when the airman described a finished pyramid like the ones in Egypt with a capstone, 1,000-foot high, and in the Qingling Mountains? This one you can see in front of you is in a plain. It's very close to the city of Shan. So this is not the same pyramid that was being described by the Air Force pilots, but yet the New York Times put it in there. So right away, we get a mystery. Why did the Times do this? Because the white pyramid seen by these pilots was something very different to the Maoling Mausoleum, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So there are hundreds of pyramids in Shanxi province. This is an aerial photo that shows you some of these. And these have a kind of similar, I mean, they're clearly pyramid shapes. They are very similar in that they don't have the finished capstone. So they're trapezoids, but they have that pyramid geometry, and you can see that they are all in these in this flat plain area near the ancient capital of Shan. But the white pyramid that I mentioned earlier, that was seen in right by the Qingling Mountains, which is about 40 miles away from Qian. So what we're seeing are pyramids that today Chinese authorities will acknowledge as actually existing, but they will acknowledge that they are mausoleums rather than finished, or rather than pyramids related in any way to Egypt. So there you have a diagram showing the city of Qian, or Shan, and kind of like in the central region of China. So this is the question. Are these pyramids, are these actually pyramids, or are they just burial mounds? That's the debate. I mean, the Chinese authorities, they want the world to think that these are merely burial mounds. And the argument is that while, you know, just as burial sites all over the world are honored, we honor the burial mounds of ancient Chinese emperors. So we don't want Westerners, we don't want anyone going there disturbing these burial mounds. So that's the approach of the Chinese authorities, and they've been doing that for decades now. But as I will be showing you, that there's another story to this altogether. Now, the Maoling Pyramid or Mausoleum is probably the most famous mausoleum pyramid in China. And we can see here, this is how it looks circa 2004, during the winter months and during the summer months. You can see trees, freshly planted trees on the pyramid, on the Maoling Mausoleum. So now you have to ask yourself the question, well, if these are truly mausoleums, the burial mounds of Chinese emperors dating back, in the case of Maoling, I think he was the first Han emperor, as I recall, but somewhere around 200 AD. So that's about 1800 years old. So if that pyramid, if that is a mausoleum that's 1800 years old, then why are the trees freshly planted? It's a good question. Why are they freshly planted? And this is how it looks now. These are all newly planted trees at the Maoling Mausoleum. The reason is that the Chinese authorities want to cover up what is actually in those pyramids, in those what they call mausoleums. They want to cover that up. They don't want the world to know that there's something else going on there. So the question we have to ask is just how old are China's pyramids? Now, this is a really important question because officially the oldest of China's pyramids, the Chinese authorities will tell you they date from the very first emperor of China, Emperor Qin, from around 200 BC. But the problem with that is that there are ancient texts that even date back to Sumerian times. These are 5,000-year-old Sumerian texts in the library of the Bogd Khan, Mongolia's former Buddhist ruler. These texts were seen by a former Russian bureaucrat for the White Russian government just before the 1917 revolution in China, in Russia. So Ferdinand Ossendowski, he escaped along with a lot of the other White Russians into Siberia, and then went into Mongolia for refuge and to fight against the communist authorities from Russia. But because this White Russian bureaucrat, he was a minister, was accompanied by a general for the White Russians, and this general for the White Russians, he helped the Bogd Khan reclaim his rule, his imperial title from the Chinese authorities who had come in and taken over Mongolia during the First World War. So this White Russian general helped the Mongolia's traditional Buddhist ruler, who is the third highest Tibetan Lama in the Tibetan religion, the Bogd Khan, helped him regain his rule. And so in gratitude to the White Russian, he basically gave him access to the library and so forth. And so that's how Ferdinand Ossendowski got to see this sacred library. And he's probably the last Westerner to see the library of the Bogd Khan before it was taken over and then either destroyed or pillaged by communist authorities immediately after the First World War, or soon after the First World War. So in these texts, some of them were 5,000-year-old Sumerian texts. So that's how old some of these texts were. And in those 5,000-year-old texts, they refer to the Chinese pyramids as being very, very old, like 5,000 years old themselves. So this is a quote from Ossendowski's book where he describes all of this. He wrote a book called Beasts, Men and Gods. So this is what he wrote. Some rooms were devoted to the library where manuscripts and volumes of different epochs in different languages and with many diverse themes filled the shelves. There also we saw tablets of clay with the cuneiform inscriptions, evidently from Babylonia, Chinese, Indian, and Tibetan books, shelved beside those of Mongolia. Groups of lamas were perusing, studying, and copying these books, preserving and spreading the ancient wisdom for their successors. End quote. So this is the library that had these ancient texts going back many thousands of years to ancient Babylonia, Sumeria. And so this is something that we really need to kind of like pay attention to, that in these ancient Chinese texts, or this library, there were references to these pyramids in China that even 5,000 years ago were considered to be ancient. Now, I mentioned 1945 was the first kind of public account of the pyramids, of this great white pyramid being found in China. Well, there was actually an earlier incident that wasn't publicized. It was a Mongolian Lama guide was guiding a number of Westerners in Shaanxi province, and they also saw the White Pyramid. And this was described by the Lama as older than 5,000 years, even in 5,000-year-old texts. So that's very interesting. So there are 5,000-year-old texts that were in the Mongolian Buddhist library before it was pillaged by the communist authorities, that described pyramids that 5,000 years ago were considered to be 5,000 years old. So that means that the pyramids date from around 10,000 years ago. Well, why is that important? That's an important date to keep in mind. Why is that important? China's pyramids date back to Atlantis. China's oldest pyramids are not mausoleums of the Qin and Han dynasty, but artifacts dating back to the ancient Atlantean era, because we're talking about something roughly around 10,000 years ago. So Plato described the destruction of Atlantis. I'm sorry, I should say more than 10,000 years ago, not 10,000, but more than 10,000 years ago, as when these pyramids were built. And that puts them in that kind of similar time frame to the destruction of Atlantis and the building of the Egyptian pyramids. Now, Plato described the destruction of Atlantis as occurring in 9,600 BC. So that's roughly 11,600 years ago. So what happened 11,600 years ago? Well, according to climatologists, what happened was that there was an event that's called the Younger Dryas. And this event happened roughly 11,600 years ago, the precise time when Plato talked about the destruction of Atlantis, and also when the pyramids were supposedly built or being built. So we're talking about something, 11,600, nearly 12,000 years ago. So if you see that graph before you, you see that roughly 12,000 years ago, there was a dramatic spike in the temperature of the planet. And that's actually, that's not correct. It wasn't a dramatic spike in the temperature of the planet. It was a dramatic spike in different areas of the planet. Because while some areas of the planet experienced a very rapid increase in heat, other areas of the planet experienced the opposite. But there you have, this is something that is widely acknowledged. Something did happen around 11,600 years ago, precisely when Plato described the destruction of Atlantis. Around the time multiple sources describe Egypt's pyramids being built, and also, as I've mentioned, a number of sources have described China's pyramids having been built. So we are talking about a worldwide system of pyramids being built just before the time of some dramatic global cataclysmic event that led to some parts of the planet undergoing a rapid increase. I mean, this is, these ice core samples come from Greenland. So that area of Greenland, we're talking North America, Europe, Western Europe, experienced a dramatic increase in heat where the ice sheets melted very, very rapidly, very rapidly. And that's acknowledged. Like North America, up until I think the Ohio Valley was covered by vast glaciers. You know, the Laurentian glaciers, ice sheet was in North America up until around 9,600 BC. So something dramatic happened to lead to that vast ice sheet melting. Now, what happened? Well, there are quite a few people that will speculate and say it was an asteroid impact, something that led to the ice sheets melting. There's a really good book, a recent book by Graham Hancock, his most recent book, where he talks about an asteroid impact causing this dramatic shift. But I don't think that's what it was. What I think happened was a pole shift. And I've been talking about pole shifts in the past, so I don't want to spend too much time on them. But essentially, according to the data that I've brought up in the past, the first person to start talking about pole shifts in depth was Charles Hapgood, who published a book in around 1956 that was, the foreword was written by Albert Einstein. It was called The Earth's Shifting Crust. And he talked about pole shifts, and that the pole shift was something that was triggered by events at the different poles, the accumulation of ice at different poles. And Hapgood's theory was endorsed by Albert Einstein, which at that time, there couldn't have been a higher endorsement. In other words, this was actually very close to the truth. And Albert Einstein, not only was he a brilliant scientist, but he was also plugged into the classified world. He worked on a number of highly classified projects. Einstein was helping with things such as understanding applications of Tesla's principles, helping the Navy, try and come up with a way of making ships invisible. So Einstein did work with Tesla. Einstein was also involved with crash retrievals of flying saucers. So basically, Einstein had that access to the highest level of classified information in the United States throughout the Second World War and afterwards. So if he was endorsing Hapgood's theory, you can take it to the bank. It really did happen this way. So this is what I believe happened about 11,600 years ago, based on Hapgood's theories. And if you wanted to follow up on that, there's a really good book. It's by Rand Flem Ath, and it's called Atlantis Under the Ice. So just do a Google search, Atlantis Under the Ice, and that'll give you a really good summary of what happened 11,000 years ago, 11,600 years ago, with the destruction of Atlantis and the pole shift. So this is basically what happened. We had North America basically covered by the ice sheets. The North Pole was right there over Hudson Bay. And the South Pole, you can see was between Australia and Antarctica. Now, you had a pole shift. So that pole shift led to North America, relative to what you're seeing now, kind of moving straight down. So North America now becomes free of ice. The North Pole is now above Canada. So the ice sheets in North America are now in a more temperate region, and that's why you actually have the vast melting off of the ice sheets. The Great Flood, stories of the Great Flood, which are universal across many, many cultures. So North America, Western Europe move into warmer latitudes because the North Pole has now gone up above Canada. But Siberia and China move into colder latitudes, which leads to flash freezing of animals and forcing the remnants of ancient civilizations to go underground. So, yeah, these are some of the images that we've seen emerge from Siberia. The top one is, I think that's an illustration. But basically something happened, and Charles Hapgood talked about this in his book, The Earth's Shifting Crust, where these woolly mammoths were discovered in Siberia with vegetation in their stomachs or vegetation in their mouths that had just been taken in, that is indicative of a warmer climate than what exists today in Siberia. So that, for Hapgood, was one of the really compelling pieces of information that convinced him that pole shifts had happened, and that while one part of the planet, that part of the planet, say North America and Western Europe, moved from a very cold climate into a warmer temperate climate because of the pole shift, on the other side of the planet, you had the opposite. So you had China and Russia, Siberia in particular, being in a warm temperate climate, much closer to the equator than it is today, to now being where we see Siberia and northern China in very cold climates, especially with Siberia. And so that led to the flash freezing of any animals that were caught up in that event. And people or civilizations that existed at that time either perished, flash frozen, or went underground. I think that a lot of the people, the civilizations at that time, knew that this was coming, and they went underground. And this was also part of the reason why the pyramids had been built.